All right. Um, Hi, I'm Marion. I'm a professor of philosophy at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I'm here today with Katie McShane, who's a professor of philosophy at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we'll be talking to you today a bit about our work in environmental philosophy. And I want to start off by offering Katie a chance to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Katie McShane. I'm at Colorado State University, and I work in environmental ethics. My focus is on the ways that different emotional attitudes people take toward the natural world influence the way that we value it. So that's what I've been working on and interested in for the last 15 or 20 years now.
Great, thanks so much, Katie. And I thought we might start off by talking a little bit about the concept of intrinsic value. Folks who do work in environmental ethics and people who are working in environmental policy spheres sometimes hear environmental philosophers talk about intrinsic value and about the distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value. Why is this concept of intrinsic value important, and how has it played a role in your work?
That's a great question. There's a lot of confusion about the term intrinsic value. It gets used in different ways by different people. But you're right that the contrast is often with instrumental or extrinsic value, it's sometimes called. Roughly, the idea of intrinsic value is valuing something for its own sake, not as a means to some further end. So if you think about when you love somebody, loving people, I think, is often a way of caring about them for their own sake. So if you were to love someone and someone asked you about that and you said, oh, yes, I love her. She's very useful to me. She, makes me into a better person and inspires me to do all sorts of wonderful things, and just talked on and on about the ways that she benefited you, people would find that sort of strange, a kind of narcissistic or self-involved way of loving another person, maybe not quite real love. The idea is real love is about caring for someone else for their own sake, not for what they can do for you. And so I think that there are actually a lot of different emotional attitudes that we take towards things that are intrinsically valuing attitudes. So things like awe and respect are ways of caring about things, not because they're useful or convenient, but for their own sakes. And so I think that's the sort of fundamental idea behind intrinsic value. And one of the things that I found interesting is that when we talk about the value of environmental goods, natural resources, we often talk in terms of their usefulness. So we talk about their instrumental value. But our ways of talking about their value don't always capture all the ways that people care about environmental goods. So some people do intrinsically value parts of the natural world. And a lot of my work has been about trying to explain what that means, what that amounts to, and how we can try to make sense of it in policy terms. So the way that I came into this was I found it very interesting that cost-benefit analysis and economic modes of valuation seem to understand value very differently from the way that people talk about value in ethics. In ethics, people take very seriously that there are not just different amounts of value, but different kinds of value, different ways of valuing things. And the differences among the ways really matters. What it is to love something or to respect something is very different from finding it convenient or useful. So in ethics, we take really seriously all these differences among different kinds of value. And in economics, it seems to be sort of one type of value. It behaves in different ways in different circumstances, but the question is really how much value, not what kind of value. And so I thought that was interesting because economic modes of valuation are really the primary modes of valuation that get taken into account when people make policy decisions. So when we're trying to figure out what's the best policy to take toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a particular place, we tend to do cost-benefit analysis. We tend to look at the sort of economic costs and benefits. But what that can do is cause us to ignore other kinds of costs and benefits. And these are things that I think really matter to people. Sometimes they get lumped under cultural services or religious values. but that doesn't quite give them their due. If you think about being in awe of something or loving something or respecting something, it's not necessarily a cultural service. It's not necessarily a religious value. It's a fairly common way of being oriented toward things in the world. But it doesn't really get represented very well when we do our cost-benefit analysis. So that's what I've sort of been interested in, exploring these different emotional orientations and trying to think about different ways of understanding value that might better capture them.
And do you think that your work actually suggests that we need more than just cost-benefit analysis to capture these ways of valuing? Or are there ways of doing cost-benefit analysis that are more expansive, that could incorporate more diverse ways of valuing that you're describing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think there are lots of people working on this right now. And I guess my own view is that we need more than cost-benefit analysis. I think cost-benefit analysis makes certain assumptions. It treats values in certain ways. It, adds them up and looks at the sum total. And, if you think about the way that values get treated in ethics, think about human rights, for example. We don't, when we're thinking about whether to violate human rights, we don't sort of add up all the benefits of doing so. We take human rights to be sort of a hard constraint on certain types of behavior. And in ethics, lots of values behave that way. There's not quite room for that in standard cost-benefit analysis. So there are lots of people working on different ways of fixing this problem. Do we add to cost-benefit analysis other ways of valuing things and then try to come up with some mechanism to determine the overall value? That gets very complicated, as you might imagine. Do we take cost-benefit analysis as one input into some kind of democratic deliberative decision-making process? That's a different way that things can go, also gets very complicated. But I think there are lots of people trying to figure out how to make sense of what they refer to as non-economic values, and figure out how to weigh those against economic values and how to run comparisons and make choices, given that they often pull in different directions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Another thing I was wondering about as you were talking is if you could say a little bit more about the particular relevance of these issues to climate change. I know climate change is an issue that both you and I have shared interests in. And I know you've also written a bit about some of these approaches to valuing and their relevance to climate change. So could you say something more about that?
Yeah, so I started to get interested in this in the context of loss and damage assessments. So this comes out of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and people are trying to assess what kinds of losses or damage will be done for that climate change that people can't adapt to or prevent. So assessing this is difficult. And the sort of primary mode of assessment for things like damage and loss is typically cost-benefit analysis. And one really nice thing about the Warsaw International Mechanism is that people started talking very early on about these non-economic losses and trying to figure out how to measure them. And here things get very complicated, because once you're into quantification, you're making certain assumptions about how value works. But if we're going to think about climate change, not just loss and damage, but also what kinds of mitigation efforts are worth it, what kinds of adaptation make sense, we're always in the business of looking at advantages and disadvantages of different plans. That is to say, costs and benefits. And it's important to really look at the full range of human values there. If we're only counting certain costs and certain benefits, we're going to make poor choices. We're going to make choices that make people's lives go worse, that make the world a poorer place. So I think a lot of my work and a lot of other people's work right now is figuring out how to make policy choices in a way that's relatively efficient and sensible, given this wide variety of values that we're trying to capture. Now, Marion, I know some of the work that you've been doing recently is about what people are calling relational value. which some people contrast with intrinsic value, but it's also a different kind of value that people are trying to capture and think about in terms of climate change. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what people mean by relational value and what's important about it.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Katie. I think in a lot of ways, the idea of relational value is connected to some of the things that you were talking about in terms of the ways in which people value the natural world multidimensionally and respond emotionally to it. So I think one of the ways in which intrinsic value has been thought about, so I'm going to get to relational value, but I want to go back to intrinsic value for a minute. One of the ways in which intrinsic value has been thought about is as sort of value in isolation from other things related to the inherent qualities of an entity or object. And I think some people have thought that although this sort of intrinsic value properties may give people a reason to value things for their own sake, as you suggest, there's a way that this conception of intrinsic value is sort of disconnected from people and meaning in their lives. I think the way that you're talking about intrinsic value is in a way much more relational because you're talking about how people respond to an old growth forest with reverence or awe or something along those lines. And I think that the idea of relational value in some ways picks up on that, focusing on how the natural world matters to people. So, I mean, going back to the climate case, which you were just talking about, I think this plays out in discussions about climate adaptation, climate loss and damage, questions about climate-related migration. So when you're thinking about how it is that people experience global climate change, people have relationships to the places that they inhabit, and those places in a way, and the elements of the biotic community in those places can become bound up with people's lives, livelihoods, and identities in ways that people have described as relational value. So whereas one conception of intrinsic value sort of treats value as like out there in things, independent of people, and instrumental value tends to focus on how natural resources can sort of serve as means to people's various ends of, timber to build houses and so on. Relational value really focuses on how particular aspects of the natural world are bound up in relation with people and communities and contribute to their identities and contribute to meaning and mattering in people's lives. I'm also interested in other dimensions of relational ethics, I guess I'd say. So one way to think about relational ethics is in terms of value, but it's also possible to think just more broadly about sort of the character and quality of human relationships with the broader natural world. And that's something that I'm also interested in. And I think that thinking in that way sometimes prompts us to ask different questions than we might ask if we were just thinking exclusively in value terms.
Yeah, I really like some of your work in this area because I think you've explored a lot of issues that don't get discussed very much in policy circles when talking about things like geoengineering and climate change, some aspects of the things that might be done that just really matter to people quite a bit, but aren't getting captured. Could you say a little bit about your work on solidarity, for example?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so this is a nice example, I think, of the way in which sort of thinking relationally might draw our attention to things that are otherwise overlooked or backgrounded in discussions of climate ethics or other areas of environmental ethics. I first wrote about solidarity in relation to climate engineering or geoengineering. And for those who aren't familiar with this idea, geoengineering is basically a set of approaches or strategies to intentionally manipulate the climate on a global scale to counteract some of the effects of climate change. And I've been most interested in a set of approaches to climate engineering called solar geoengineering, which would involve reflecting some small portion of sunlight back into space to help cool the planet. Wouldn't do anything to change the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so it wouldn't really address the root cause of climate change, but might counteract some of the effects of climate change, or so people think. This is still being researched and not that much is known yet about the full implications of these approaches. But I got interested in solidarity in relation to geoengineering because I was thinking about how might research on geoengineering or development of geoengineering strategies impact climate responses more broadly. And one thing that struck me about climate geoengineering is that it's a pretty fractious topic. It tends to be divisive, and people have really strongly polarized views on it often. So some people think it's just, we shouldn't even be thinking about this. Intervening with the Earth's climate on the global scale would just be intentionally would be a grave mistake. And other people think that this is really an important path to pursue, sort of given the severity and seriousness of the climate crisis, that we sort of need all the tools in the toolkit, sometimes people say. One thing I was worried about in relation, or thinking about in relation to this, is how might introducing the idea of geoengineering and pursuing it as a climate response affect solidarity, in the sense that it might affect more broadly the capacity of nations and other entities to cooperate around global climate change. So we have kind of a nascent global consensus that climate mitigation or drawdown of greenhouse gases is necessary, but geoengineering seems like a topic that tends to create controversy. So one of the things I was drawing out is how might these approaches affect solidaristic relationships on which we depend to develop cooperative climate solutions or responses.
That's great. And it sounds similar to what you've been doing in talking about intergenerational buck passing, that there are these sort of effects on people and things that we care about, things that are very important, not just for our lives, but also for our sort of abilities to work together. There are these impacts that people just aren't noticing in thinking about these policies. Nobody talking about, besides you, nobody talking about geoengineering is taking seriously its effect on things like solidarity, our ability to sort of establish fellow feeling as a basis for, collaboration and that sort of thing. Would you talk a little bit about your work on intergenerational buck passing?
Sure, yeah. And I would say, just, by way of an aside, I think there is increasing attention to the relational dimensions of climate issues, which is, I'm really happy to see. Folks like Kyle White, for example, have talked about, that we focus a lot on climate tipping points, but we should also be focusing on relational tipping points. So if we don't have trust, if we don't have solidarity, if we don't have relationships that can sustain us as we negotiate our way through a transition to a different kind of economy, not based on fossil fuels, then we're really in trouble. And that those sort of relational dimensions can be sort of as critical to sort of going forward well and justly as the sort of physical climate parameters, I guess. In terms of intergenerational relations, I've kind of been interested in this idea of intergenerational buck passing that you mentioned, which is something that Steve Gardner has written about. And his suggestion is kind of that each generation sort of has an incentive to pass the climate buck to the next generation, because there are sort of real benefits now to burning fossil fuels, whether it's sort of driving our kids to activities, or taking a plane flight to attend a wedding, or visit family that are distant from us, or so on. But the costs are sort of externalized to future generations, in part because of lags in the climate system, which means that fossil fuels emitted today create impacts for many, many decades down the line. So I've been thinking about sort of how this plays out in terms of our relations with others across generations, and particularly thinking about what people in my generation, who I would argue are sort of in relative positions of power, as compared to folks who are, many of whom are college students today, 18 to 22-year-olds who will kind of inherit the effects of the policies, practices, and institutions that are currently in place. And so I've been thinking about what it is that those of us who are empowered to do something about climate change can do to build and sustain more positive intergenerational relations. And part of that, I think, involves really confronting forms of moral ambivalence that we have about our own relation to climate change, and the ways in which people like me are sort of very concerned about climate change, but also invested in certain ways in the status quo. And I think confronting that moral ambivalence is going to be really important in maintaining sort of intergenerational forms of hope and hopeful action.
Thanks. So here's a question that I've been thinking about during our conversation. So I think the two of us both think that there are all these complex psychological and social aspects to problems like climate change that are not taken as seriously as they should be. Why do you think they're not? I'm just curious. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, but what's your sense?
Yeah, so I'll give you a brief answer, and then I want to hear your answer to that same question, actually. I mean, I think we like to simplify things, and a lot of the issues that we're talking about are complex and nuanced, and involve looking not just at the world quantitatively, but also trying to understand things qualitatively. So trying to really understand how it is that people care about places that they inhabit, and how it is that on the ground, climate change plays out in particular communities, whether that affects people's ability to grow certain crops, or to continue to sustain fisheries that are important to economies and livelihoods, or just to enjoy a walk in the forest in the summer without choking on wildfire smoke. So I think those things are just hard to attend to sometimes from a policy perspective, hard to quantify, hard to aggregate. And that's one of the reasons that there tends to be more focus on sort of trying to reduce everything to a common metric and add up all the costs and benefits, aggregate them, and then come up with a simple bottom line. But what's your thought on that same question? I think it's a really interesting question that you've posed.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with you. I think numbers are easier than some of this complicated qualitative stuff. And when people are in a hurry and trying to make decisions about complex things, the more that you can simplify the problem you're dealing with, the better, the easier it is to make a decision. I also think that some problems like climate change really do require a kind of global coordination and a shared understanding globally. And so, at the COP meetings, when people are trying to figure out, whether to do this or that, even just at the national level, you need to take a very broad view, and it's hard to capture all the detail. If you think about people's relation to place, that looks so different in so many different places. And so trying to figure out what to do about climate change while taking that into account is, as you say, really difficult, right? There's so many details there. And I think people try to look for something that's not just quantifiable, but something that's the same from place to place, as opposed to things that sort of take different shapes and, have different aspects in different places. And so there's a kind of simplification that happens for that reason too. But I think it's interesting. I mean, I think if you look at other aspects of human life where people need to make decisions about really complicated, difficult psychological and cultural issues at a very broad scale, you get a lot of problems. I mean, if you think about the kinds of backlashes we're seeing in different places against national governments that make decisions that affect municipalities, and we're getting sort of the resurgence of localism and nationalism and a real rebellion against globalization, but globalism. And so I think those simplifying assumptions really do have serious costs. I think you get people making bad decisions when they don't pay attention to some of that more local, more particular stuff. And, I think here we both live in the American West. We've seen a lot of, debates about land use policy, and locally there's a lot of resentment of the national government, the federal government that has policies that people locally don't like. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see with climate change. I'm not really sure how the decision making is going to go, but I feel like I can sort of predict some of the bad effects of ignoring some of these more relational values. I feel like we've seen stuff like this before. And that's part of what animates my work, and I think yours too, is really worrying about what the costs are of ignoring these sorts of aspects of environmental issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are seeing the development of some better models for context-sensitive environmental policy that's kind of nested, and some use the term polycentric, but sort of operating at multiple scales and multiple levels. But I think you're absolutely right that one of the challenges is figuring out how to sort of nest those responses in a way that adds up to sort of a coherent, policy that's oriented toward, in the case of climate change, greenhouse gas reductions, but then is also sensitive to the ways in which that plays out at local scales and the needs of local communities, whether that's in terms of climate adaptation or in terms of just economic transitions away from fossil fuels and so on. So,
right. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ask if you had any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
No, I think it's going to be interesting to see how some of these experiments that we're seeing right now are going to play out. That combination, everybody who works on climate change, sort of maybe a little hopeful and also very worried. So, but it'll be really interesting to see how some of these projects go.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I actually think that combination of attitudes is probably a little hopeful and somewhat worried is an appropriate one, fitting one in relation to the global climate change that we're currently experiencing and facing down the line.
Great. Well, it's great talking to you, Marion.
You too, Katie. Thanks so much for the conversation.
All right. Thank you.